Two athletes stand at the starting line in ancient Olympia. Same training, same genetics, and the same years of preparation, grinding through sand and heat. But there is one difference. One of them ate a full breakfast 2 hours ago. Bread soaked in olive oil, cheese, dried figs, everything his body might need for explosive energy. The other has not eaten since yesterday evening. His stomach is empty. So by modern standards, he should be weaker. But what happens next will challenge everything we think we know about performance. The signal drops. They sprint. 30 seconds in, the fed athlete's legs feel heavy. His breathing labored. Blood diverted to his gut, still processing that meal. The hungry one moves like his body weighs nothing. Each stride clean and powerful, with no internal weight dragging him down. This was not a single fluke. This pattern repeated across centuries of Greek athletic culture, documented in texts that historians largely ignored because it contradicted everything modern fitness believes about fueling performance. Walk into any gym today, and you will hear the same advice echoing off every wall. Eat before you train, or you will lose muscle. Never skip breakfast, or your metabolism crashes. Fuel every 3 hours, or your body enters starvation mode and clings to fat. The Greeks would have called this madness. They trained hungry, competed hungry, and built bodies that remain the gold standard of human physique 2,000 years after they died. The marble statues standing in museums, with shoulders and abs that modern bodybuilders study and try to replicate, document real bodies carved in stone because they represented an achievable ideal. And here is what nobody in the supplement industry wants you to understand. Those men did not achieve those results despite training on empty stomachs. They achieved them because of it. So if you want to understand how fasting actually shaped their strength, their health, and even the way they thought, stay with me, because the perfect physique, to the Greeks, was never just about muscle. It was about building a body that functioned efficiently, a mind that remained sharp, and a system that stayed resilient over time. And the real advantage had nothing to do with skipping meals for aesthetics, and everything to do with how and why they used hunger as a deliberate tool to train all three. Because the Greeks understood something we have completely forgotten. The body follows the mind, and hunger was the tool they used to train it. Pythagoras wasn't just a mathematician proving theorems. He was also studying human performance in ways that would make modern researchers uncomfortable. He fasted for 40 days before taking major exams at the Alexandria school. Not as a spiritual practice, but as preparation. Afterward, he documented something that contradicted all common sense about how brains need constant glucose. His mental clarity increased dramatically. His physical capability improved, and his focus sharpened to a point where complex problems became simple. He was so convinced by the results that he refused to teach advanced students until they'd fasted themselves. If you wanted access to higher knowledge, you first had to prove you could master the most basic human drive: appetite. Here is what was happening inside his body that he could not measure but clearly observed through outcomes. When you eat constantly, insulin stays elevated, locking fat into cells and preventing your body from accessing stored energy. Your metabolism becomes inflexible, dependent on external fuel arriving every few hours, or performance collapses. Blood flow gets diverted to digestion, pulling resources from muscles and brain. When you train fasted, everything inverts. Insulin drops, unlocking stored energy. Fat oxidation increases because your body has to pull from reserves. Growth hormone spikes naturally during fasting windows, preserving muscle while body composition improves. Blood stays available for working muscles and cognitive function, instead of being trapped in your gut processing breakfast. Greek athletes were not just maintaining performance despite hunger. They were accessing a metabolic state that made them more efficient. Their bodies learned to switch fuel sources smoothly, burning fat when food was absent and storing nutrients efficiently when food returned. Modern bodies never learn this flexibility because we panic at the first stomach rumble and immediately eat something to silence it. The Greeks treated that rumble as a signal that training could begin. We treat it as an emergency that must be fixed before anything productive can happen. But what if hunger wasn't just performance optimization? What if it was medicine? Because peak performance means nothing if the body is quietly breaking down. And that's something the Greeks understood perfectly. Strength and clarity were useless without health. And that's where fasting became something far more radical. Hippocrates watched patients die while being force-fed by well-meaning families. He documented something that contradicted every instinct about caring for the sick. He concluded this: to eat when you are sick is to feed your illness. This was not a radical opinion formed in isolation. It emerged from a pattern that Greek physicians had been quietly observing for years. When serious illness struck, appetite did not increase, it disappeared. And the body seemed to reject food on its own. Instead of fighting that response, they began asking a different question. What if the loss of appetite was not a malfunction, but a signal? And so, rather than overriding it, they sometimes reinforced it. Fasting became a therapeutic intervention grounded not in theory, but in careful observation of how the body naturally responded to disease. Their logic was direct. Disease represented imbalance, and digestion required massive energy. If the body was desperately trying to heal, forcing it to simultaneously process food seemed like sabotage. When the body enters fasted states, insulin drops and inflammatory markers decrease. That process is called autophagy, which means damaged cellular components get broken down and recycled. So your cells literally eat their own garbage to clean the house. This cellular cleanup earned a Nobel Prize when scientists finally understood the mechanism. But it has been happening in human bodies since we evolved, particularly during the fasting periods our ancestors experienced regularly between successful hunts. Short fasting periods trigger repair pathways that modern medicine is learning to manipulate pharmaceutically. They improve metabolic regulation. They increase stress resistance at the cellular level. And they reduce chronic inflammation, driving most diseases that kill people in developed countries. Hippocrates did not know the word autophagy. He just knew that periodic food restriction often improved outcomes in ways that constant feeding did not. And this philosophy extended far beyond medicine into how the sharpest minds prepared themselves for intellectual work. Because the Greeks didn't separate physical excellence from mental excellence. A resilient body supported a sharper mind, and a sharper mind built a stronger body. And surprisingly, fasting became the link between the two. Take Plato, who stood before his students and made an announcement that would seem absurd in modern universities. Advanced philosophy lessons were now restricted to those who had fasted. If you wanted access to higher teachings, you first proved you could control the most basic biological drive. This was not just a random thought experiment. It was based on something philosophers consistently noticed across ancient Greece. The mind functioned differently when the stomach was empty. Thoughts became sharper. Focus intensified. The usual mental fog that followed meals simply did not appear. Modern neuroscience offers explanations they could not articulate, but clearly experienced. During fasting, the body produces ketones as alternative brain fuel. These molecules cross the blood-brain barrier and may enhance cognitive function in ways glucose cannot match. Research links fasting to increases in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that helps your brain form new neural connections and learn more effectively. Your brain literally becomes more capable of complex thought during fasted states. In temples dedicated to Asclepius, god of healing, priests required fasting before ritual practices. Purification meant temporary abstinence from food, sex, and activities that scattered attention. The goal was internal clarity, removing anything that might interfere with perception and judgment. The underlying belief was simple. If you cannot control appetite, you cannot control anything else. Mastery begins with the most basic urges. Compare this to modern life where we eat constantly while distracted, chase dopamine from processed food engineered to override satiety signals, and silence hunger within minutes of feeling it. Then we wonder why focus feels impossible, why attention spans shrink, and why mental clarity seems rare. The Greeks believed hunger was a teacher, forcing patience and demanding presence, while training willpower through direct repeated experience. They did not avoid it. They used it deliberately as preparation for important mental work. So when we look at those marble bodies and ask how they achieved that level of physical perfection, we are asking the wrong question. The real question is, what kind of mind does it take to build it? It is the kind that understands restraint. Return to the starting line in Olympia. The difference between those two athletes was not magical nutrition or superior genetics. It was metabolic flexibility, mental clarity, and the quiet advantage of a body that knew how to function without constant supply. But that advantage did not stop at performance. Fasting reinforced the body by improving efficiency and reducing unnecessary strain. It reinforced health by allowing repair mechanisms to activate instead of forcing constant digestion. And it reinforced the mind by demanding discipline, sharpening focus, and training restraint at the most basic level. The physique the Greeks built was not just muscle wrapped around bone. It was the visible result of an internal system working in harmony, a resilient body, a clear mind, and a metabolism adapted to rhythm rather than excess. The secret was never exotic ingredients or superior knowledge. It was their relationship with hunger itself. They understood that the body follows the mind, and that the mind grows stronger each time it refuses to obey impulse. Strength, for them, was not built through constant accumulation. It was built through rhythm, recovery, and restraint. And that is the secret. Everything you have been told about building a powerful body follows the same logic. Eat more, train harder, fuel the performance. And if you have been following that logic, you have been building the wrong body. Because what you've been building is a body that only works under perfect conditions. The kind that collapses when food is unavailable, when conditions are hostile, and when the situation demands something your gym never prepared you for. But the Greeks, they built the exact opposite. Take the Spartans, who famously held the pass at Thermopylae with 300 warriors against an army of 100,000, and they did it while only having eaten one modest meal the night before. By every modern standard of nutrition science, they should have been depleted, weak, and incapable of sustaining elite physical performance. Instead, they held that pass for 3 days. And the bodies they built doing it, lean, explosive, functionally indestructible, are still the physical standard the entire Western world measures itself against 2,500 years later. This video is about the biological system that made that possible. A civilization that built the most celebrated warrior physiques on almost no food. And one part of what that system produced directly contradicts something most people in the fitness space, including this channel, have told you before. Subscribe and stay to the end. Because when you understand it, the way you think about every morning you train changes permanently. But before we get to the biology, we need to understand the system that produced it. Because the Spartan body was not an accident of culture or genetics. It was the deliberate output of the most precisely engineered human conditioning program the ancient world ever documented. And the feature that separated it from everything else was not the training. It was the hunger. At age 7, every male Spartan citizen was placed into the agoge, the state conditioning program documented in precise detail by Plutarch and Xenophon. Boys trained twice daily, running, wrestling, weapons drills, endurance work across the valley of the Eurotas River. But the feature that separated the agoge from every other training system in the ancient world was not the training itself. It was the deliberate absence of food. Xenophon writes it plainly. The food allowance was set so that boys would know what it was to go with their hunger, unsatisfied. Plutarch confirms the purpose was equally explicit, to accustom boys to hunger so that hunger could never stop them. So it was not deprivation. It was engineering. Every morning, those boys trained before eating. When they became adult citizens, the same structure continued through the Syssitia, the daily communal meal system that required every Spartan male to eat one modest evening meal, by law, for life. No breakfast, no lunch. One meal, in the evening, after everything else was already done. Here is what that pattern was doing to their bodies. When you train in a fasted state, your body produces growth hormone at significantly higher levels than after eating. Growth hormone does two things simultaneously. It uses stored fat as energy and protects lean muscle from being broken down as fuel. The muscle stays, the fat depletes. Body composition shifts, not through eating less, but through the specific hormonal response that the fasted training window triggers every single morning. The Spartan body was being shaped by this mechanism daily, without any Greek physician knowing what growth hormone was. Insulin adds a second layer. In the fasted state, insulin is low. Low insulin means the body cannot store fat. It must access and burn what it has already accumulated. Every pre-dawn training session in the Agoj was a fat mobilization session by structural default. And then there is autophagy, a cellular process that earned a Nobel Prize in 2016 when scientists finally understood it fully. Cells under fasting and physical stress break down and recycle their own damaged components. A body that trains fasted consistently over years does not just burn fat. It rebuilds its own tissue from the cleared material. It is cleaner, denser, and structurally superior to tissue built only from dietary protein. The lean, dense physique visible in every surviving depiction of Spartan warriors was the biological output of a fasting pattern that triggered every mechanism the male body has for building lean functional mass. Not the goal, the result. But lean doesn't automatically mean strong. What fasting was doing to Spartan functional performance in direct combat operated through a completely separate mechanism. That mechanism explains why 300 men could rotate in and out of a front line for hours against opponents who vastly outnumbered them, and why their output did not degrade while their enemies did. And it starts with a concept that most people in modern fitness have never been taught. The Spartans who fought at Thermopylae were not the largest men in the ancient world. They were the most functionally capable. And the difference between those two things is built over years of training in a fasted state. The concept that researchers now call metabolic flexibility is the body's ability to switch efficiently between glucose and fat as fuel. Most modern people train after only a few hours without food, not long enough to deplete glucose stores, not long enough to force the body to access fat as its primary fuel. The metabolism never genuinely adapts because it never genuinely has to. A body that trains after 16 or more hours without food, consistently, daily, across years, builds a fundamentally different capacity. It learns to access stored fat efficiently because it has no other option. It becomes independent of a fuel source. In battle, where food can be unavailable for an entire day, that soldier maintains output, while his opponent, whose metabolism never learned to function without supply, physically deteriorates. Fasting is also what biologists call a hormetic stressor, a mild repeated pressure that, rather than weakening the body, forces upward adaptation. It is the same principle behind resistance training and cold exposure. Daily caloric restriction while training forces the body to produce more output with less input. It becomes more efficient per unit of fuel and more capable under resource scarcity, which is precisely the condition of real warfare. This is why the Spartan inspection system mattered. Plutarch documents that adult Spartan men underwent regular physical assessments throughout their lives. A man who had visibly softened faced formal public consequences. The standard being maintained was not aesthetic. It was functional, the demonstrated ability to perform regardless of supply conditions. A body that could only perform when fully fed was a liability. A body that performed regardless was a weapon. The fasting pattern built that second kind of body by default. Physique and performance capacity were not separate outputs. They were the same mechanism running simultaneously through every morning training session for an entire adult lifetime. But there is a third output that fasting was producing, and it had nothing to do with the body at all. What hunger was doing to the Spartan mind in the hours before combat is what no opponent who faced them ever fully understood. And modern neuroscience can now explain exactly what it was. When the body has not eaten, something very specific happens to the brain. Norepinephrine rises. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter most directly associated with alertness, focused aggression, and physical readiness. It is the same chemical that sharpens attention in a moment of genuine danger. Short-term fasting elevates it measurably, and the body, detecting that food has not arrived, shifts into its highest output mode. Threat perception sharpens. Reaction time improves. Physical aggression increases. A Spartan warrior moving toward battle in a fasted state was neurologically primed by his own hunger, in a way that a fed opponent simply was not. The second mechanism is ketone production. During extended fasting, the liver produces ketones as an alternative fuel source for the brain. Research links ketone availability to increases in BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein that strengthens neural connections and improves cognitive performance under physical stress. A fasted brain is running on a cleaner, more efficient fuel than glucose. Pattern recognition improves. Decision-making under pressure sharpens, and the mental performance that combat demands is actually enhanced, not degraded, by the fasted state. The Greeks had a word for the specific mental condition fasting was producing. Thumos. It is the spirited, competitive, physically aggressive dimension of the human soul, distinct from both reason and appetite. Modern neuroscience would locate it in the norepinephrine and cortisol systems. The Spartans cultivated it deliberately through hunger, competition, and physical hardship from childhood. Every morning they trained hungry. They were conditioning not just their bodies, but this precise mental state, the aggressive readiness that made them genuinely dangerous. But this is also where the most important and misunderstood piece of the Spartan system arrives. And it directly contradicts something this channel has said before. In a previous video on this channel, I told you that high cortisol is testosterone's direct enemy. That elevated cortisol suppresses testosterone, drives fat storage, and undermines physical recovery. That is accurate, but it is only half of the truth. And the half I didn't explain is exactly what the Spartan system was built on. Cortisol is not a single phenomenon. It is a stress response that functions completely differently depending on whether the stress is acute or chronic. Short-term fasting raises cortisol acutely. This is documented and not contested. The body responds to caloric restriction with a temporary cortisol spike as part of its mobilization response, the same class of response as intense exercise or cold exposure. This is acute cortisol, and acute cortisol does something entirely different from its chronic counterpart. It sharpens focus. It raises physical aggression. It increases output capacity. It is the body's ignition signal, the hormonal mechanism that activates peak performance mode in response to a stressor that demands a physical response. Combined with the norepinephrine elevation that fasting also produces, the Spartan who trained and competed in a fasted state was running on a biological performance state that cannot be replicated by a pre-workout supplement. The previous content on this channel addressed chronic cortisol, the unresolved, sustained elevation that modern men carry from constant stimulation, poor sleep, and stress that never fully ends. That content was accurate in the context it addressed. Chronic cortisol does exactly what I described. It slowly dismantles your testosterone, your body composition, and your recovery capacity. The Spartan pattern was structurally different. The fasting produced an acute cortisol spike every morning. That spike served its purpose. It powered the training, sharpened the mind, and primed the body. Then the structure of the day resolved it. Cortisol naturally follows a circadian rhythm, highest in the morning and falling through the day. The Spartan pattern of morning training, physical activity, and a single evening communal meal at the Sisisha aligned with this rhythm. The spike worked. The evening allowed it to fully collapse. And into that collapse, as the dual hormone hypothesis published in Hormones and Behavior in 2010 confirms, testosterone operates without interference. When cortisol is fully resolved, testosterone's effects on strength, recovery, and physical adaptation express themselves completely. The Spartans were not consciously engineering their hormonal cycles. They had no concept of cortisol or testosterone. But the daily pattern they built, morning fast, training, physical effort, evening meal, communal rest, was producing an optimal hormonal rhythm as a structural consequence of how they lived. The modern man's problem is not that he has cortisol, it is that he never resolves it. The stress never fully ends. The cortisol never fully drops. And testosterone never gets its window. That window is what the art of living like a man e-guide is built around. It's a daily framework for men who are done letting their hormones work against them and ready to structure their lives the way the Spartan pattern did. Link is in the description. Now, back to Thermopylae, where everything this video has described showed up together on the same morning. A scout sent by Xerxes returned from the Greek lines with a report. The Spartans, the 300 men standing between the Persian army and the rest of Greece, were combing their hair, like men with nowhere else to be. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, a former Spartan king living in exile at the Persian court, and demanded an explanation. Demaratus's answer is recorded by Herodotus. It is their custom, when they are about to risk their lives, to adorn their heads with care. Read through everything this video has covered. That image lands differently now. Those men were not calm because they were resigned to dying. They were calm because they were in the exact neurological state they had trained themselves into every single morning since age 7. Norepinephrine elevated, cortisol spiked and functional, metabolically flexible, hormonally primed, mentally sharpened by hunger. The fasted state they were in that morning was not special preparation for Thermopylae. It was a normal day for them. Herodotus documents the fighting that followed. The Spartans rotated in and out of the front line, maintaining fresh output against the Persian advance for hours. Xerxes sent his best infantry. Then, the Immortals, 10,000 elite soldiers, the finest in the Persian Empire. They were repelled repeatedly by men who had eaten one modest meal the night before. When Xerxes sent a written demand for the Spartans to lay down their weapons, Leonidas responded in 2 words. Plutarch records them. Come and take them. Plutarch also records a line attributed to Lycurgus, the lawgiver who designed the entire system. When asked why Spartan soldiers were given so little food, so that they may be accustomed to endure the want of it. The ancient way exists to recover what was lost. If this changes how you think about the next morning you train before eating, you already know what to do. Modern fitness has split the human body into 2 categories that it treats as completely separate. You are either building strength or you are building endurance. You are either in a bulking phase or a cutting phase. You are either feeding your muscles or you are burning your fat. The fitness industry built an entire ecosystem of products, programs, and conflicting advice around this idea. And most people who have spent years following it can tell you the same thing. They got reasonably good at one or the other, but never genuinely both at once. The Vikings didn't make this distinction because their bodies didn't. A Viking oarsman in 900 AD could row for 8 continuous hours across open water, step off the longship, carry his weapons and shield across rough terrain, and fight. The same man who could lift stones that modern strongmen treat as competition weights had endurance that modern athletes train specifically for and still cannot fully replicate. He was not a strength athlete who also happened to have endurance. He was both, completely, in a body that was lean and functional and built for sustained performance in any condition. And the reason both were possible at the same time, the reason the Viking physique was something the modern fitness model cannot produce no matter how well you follow the program, comes down to a single hormone. The Vikings produced this hormone at levels modern bodybuilders spend thousands of pounds trying to replicate artificially. The supplement industry will never tell you how to raise it naturally because the method is completely free. They raised it every single day, without knowing its name, without understanding the mechanism, and without doing anything that looked like training for it. The answer is in how they ate. More precisely, it is in how long they did not eat. If you want to understand how a culture with no gyms, no protein powder, and no sports science built the most physically complete bodies in Northern European history, subscribe and stay with me. What the Vikings discovered by accident is something decades of modern research have since confirmed. The science is extraordinary. The Vikings didn't design their eating pattern for performance. They didn't time their meals around training windows or calculate their fasting protocols. They ate the way they ate because their environment, their working day, and their resources made anything else impractical. Every morning, roughly 1 hour after waking, they ate the dagmal, the day meal. Leftover stew reheated from the night before, dense dark bread made from rye or barley, skyer if it was available. Skyer is worth noting specifically. A fermented dairy product native to Scandinavia that contains around 11 grams of protein per 100 grams, which is higher than Greek yogurt and higher than most dairy products available today. The Vikings didn't know about protein content. They just knew it kept them full and functional through the demands of the day. Then they worked. Think farming, fishing, shipbuilding, rowing, even training for combat. They did hours of sustained physical labor in Scandinavian weather that demanded constant output from the body. They ate nothing until the day's work was finished. The natmal, the night meal, came in the evening. This consisted of meat stew, fish, vegetables, and bread. It was the main meal of the day, eaten communally after everything that needed doing had been done. Between the end of the natmal and the dagmal the following morning, there were roughly 16 to 18 hours without food. Every single day. This was not a wellness strategy or a performance protocol. For them, it was just life. Modern science now has a precise term for what this eating pattern creates: intermittent fasting. Specifically, the 16 to 18 hour fasting window that current research identifies as the threshold at which the body begins triggering its most powerful physiological responses. And the Vikings, they hit this window every single day for their entire lives. But here is the thing. The fasting window alone is not the secret. The secret is what happens inside the body during those 18 hours, and specifically what it does to the one hormone capable of simultaneously building muscle, burning fat, and improving endurance capacity. No supplement replicates it. No training protocol produces it as reliably. And the Vikings were flooding their bodies with it every morning before they even picked up an oar. In 1988, a team of researchers at the University of Virginia published a study in the Journal of Clinical Investigation that should have permanently changed the way the fitness industry talked about fasting and muscle. It did not, partly because it contradicted too much of what the supplement industry was selling at the time. But the data has never been disputed. It has only been confirmed, repeatedly, by subsequent research over the following 3 decades. The study measured growth hormone secretion in healthy men over 24 hours, first on a normal fed day, then during a fast. What they found was not a modest improvement, it was a transformation. During fasting, growth hormone pulse frequency, the number of times the body released the hormone in bursts over 24 hours, more than doubled. Pulse amplitude, the size of each release, also doubled. A 1992 follow-up study by Hartman and colleagues, measuring the same mechanisms with greater precision, found that 2 days of fasting produced a 5-fold increase in total 24-hour growth hormone production, 5 times more from the same body through the mechanism of not eating. Here is why this matters at a practical level. Growth. Hormone is the only anabolic hormone in the human body that simultaneously does 3 things. It builds and preserves lean muscle mass. It specifically targets stored fat, not subcutaneous fat under the skin, but visceral fat, the metabolically active fat surrounding the organs, and mobilizes it for fuel. It also improves the efficiency of the mitochondria, the energy-producing structures inside every muscle cell, which is the physiological foundation of endurance capacity. Most hormones do one of these things. Growth hormone does all 3 at once. The Vikings, through an eating pattern dictated entirely by the demands of their working day, were producing it at levels that modern pharmaceutical companies charge thousands to replicate through injection. They did not know any of this. They just felt strong. They just felt capable of sustained effort in ways that fed men sometimes were not. Across generations, they noticed that eating twice and working hard produced a body that functioned extraordinarily well. Now here is the part that should make the modern fitness model genuinely uncomfortable. The fitness industry's division of strength and endurance into separate categories is not based on biology. It is based on convenience. It is easier to sell a strength program and a separate endurance program than to explain that both qualities come from the same underlying physiological adaptation, and that the adaptation requires neither. The Viking body did not separate them, because at the cellular level they are not separate. Growth hormone, produced in abundance during the 18-hour fasting window the Vikings maintained daily, does something specific to muscle tissue that the modern distinction between strength training and cardio completely misses. It increases the density and efficiency of mitochondria within muscle fibers, meaning the same muscle that generates force can also sustain that force for longer without fatigue. More mitochondria means more aerobic capacity. More aerobic capacity means better recovery between explosive efforts. Better recovery between explosive efforts means more total output over time. This is precisely what rowing across the North Sea demanded. Not a single quality. Both qualities simultaneously from the same tissue. Research published in PubMed Central in 2020 and confirmed by a Nature Communications study in 2024 found that short-term fasting does not negatively impact endurance performance and may specifically improve fat oxidation during sustained effort. The body's ability to switch between burning glucose for explosive power and burning fat for sustained endurance, what researchers call metabolic flexibility, is directly enhanced by the fasting window. The Vikings were metabolically flexible, not by design but by default. Their eating pattern built it automatically. A fed athlete on a modern plan fueling every 3 hours never builds this flexibility. The body never learns to access stored fat efficiently, because stored fat is never the only option. It is always waiting for the next meal. The Viking body had no such option. It learned, out of necessity, to run on whatever was available. And what was available was almost always its own stored energy, delivered cleanly, efficiently, over sustained hours of demanding physical work. That is the paradox resolved. They were strong and had endurance for the same reason. The fasting window, the growth hormone, the metabolic flexibility that both produced. Not two qualities from two different training methods. One quality, physical completeness, from one accidental daily habit. But none of this tells you what to actually do with it. You don't need to row across the North Sea. The biology doesn't require it. What it requires is the fasting window, the 16 to 18 hours between your last meal and your first. Not as a dramatic intervention or an aggressive protocol, but as a default. The way the Vikings defaulted to it because their day demanded it and their environment enforced it. In practical terms, finish your evening meal and don't eat again until 1 hour after waking the following morning. That is the Dagmal and Natmal structure, applied directly to a modern day, without any further modification. If your evening meal ends at 8, your first meal the following morning comes around 8 or 9. The window opens. The growth hormone response begins within the first few hours and continues building through the night. What you eat in those 2 meals matters, but less than the timing. The Vikings ate dense, real food: meat, fish, fermented dairy, rye bread, vegetables, high protein, high fat, low in refined sugar. No snacking, no constant grazing. 2 meals that were substantial enough to fuel genuine physical output across the hours between them. The training that sits inside this window doesn't need to be complicated. The Vikings didn't split upper and lower body days or periodize their strength work across training blocks. They did hard things: rowing, carrying, wrestling, lifting heavy objects. Compound movements that demanded the whole body, sustained over time, against real resistance. The growth hormone their fasting produced protected the muscle. The training gave it a reason to exist. The combination produced something the modern gym model, for all its complexity, has rarely managed to replicate. The Viking physique wasn't built through 2 separate pursuits. It was built through one life lived in a specific rhythm. Work hard, eat well, fast long, sleep, and repeat. The body responds to that rhythm the same way it always has, the same way it responded in 900 AD on a longship crossing the North Sea, the same way the science confirmed in 1988, and the same way it will respond for you, starting this week, if you give it the conditions it was built to run on. If this is the knowledge you come here for, subscribe. There is far more where this came from, and most of it has been sitting in plain sight for over 1,000 years. The gate opens at the Ephesus amphitheatre, and 25,000 Romans lose their minds. Because the man who walks out isn't just fit, he's massive, broad across the shoulders, thick through the chest, with arms built from years of daily combat. And while that might not surprise you, what he just had for breakfast will. Because that man just finished the smallest meal you can imagine. No steak, no eggs, no protein, at least not the kind you're used to. By every principle the fitness industry is built on, that man should be at a disadvantage. His muscles should be deficient, his recovery should be failing, and his body should be losing this fight before it starts. Yet his bones tell a different story. When researchers analyzed the skeletal remains of gladiators 1,800 years later, they found something that contradicted the entire logic of modern sports nutrition. These men's bones showed significantly higher mineral content than every free Roman citizen around them. So the man who ate almost no protein had stronger, denser bones than the population that watched him fight. Which leaves one question sitting in the middle of all of it. What made this possible? Subscribe and stay to the end, because the answer is not one thing. It is a system, and by the time this is over, you will understand exactly what actually builds a strong body. Not the way the supplement industry told you, but the way bones that are 1,800 years old prove. But before we get there, we need to start with what was actually on his plate. And what was on his plate has a name, a recipe, and a 2,000-year paper trail. Because the Romans did not guess at what gladiators should eat, they documented it. The formal gladiatorial diet had a name: Gladiatorium Saginum, the gladiatorial feeding regime. It was not left to individual preference. Gladiators were managed, housed, and fed by the lanista, the training school owner, who had a direct financial interest in keeping these men healthy and capable. Their diet was a prescription, and the contents of that prescription are specific: barley, broad beans, and minimal meat. The staple meal even had its own name, pulse, a thick porridge of barley and fava beans, boiled together, sometimes with onion, vinegar, and garlic. Cato the Elder documents the recipe. It was simple, it was filling, and it was eaten every single day. Pliny the Elder records the nickname that had stuck to gladiators across the Roman world in his Naturalis Historia, written in the 1st century AD, Hordearii, barley eaters. Part of why they ate this way was practical. Barley was cheap, abundant, and easy to produce in bulk for a training school feeding hundreds of men. But whatever the reason, the diet was consistent, structured, and enforced. In 1993, Austrian archaeologists uncovered a mass burial site outside the ancient city of Ephesus in modern Turkey. They found more than 60 individuals, identified by carved marble reliefs showing combat scenes. It is the only confirmed gladiator graveyard ever found. In 2014, a team from the Medical University of Vienna and the University of Bern published a study in the journal PLOS1, led by forensic anthropologist Fabian Cans. They subjected bones from 22 of those gladiators to isotopic analysis, measuring carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur ratios locked into bone collagen with chemical precision. The result was that gladiators consumed a diet dominated by plant foods, primarily barley and legumes. Low nitrogen isotope values are the specific biochemical signature of minimal animal protein and high legume intake, meaning the gladiators of Ephesus ate almost no meat. And yet, their bodies showed exactly what everyone assumes only animal protein can build. So something in that diet was working. And it was not an accident. Because barley and beans together are not an accidental pairing. They are, whether the Romans understood the biochemistry or not, one of the most effective fueling systems ever assembled for explosive physical performance. Start with the barley. Cooked as porridge, as gladiators ate it daily, it delivers a concentrated source of slow-releasing glycogen fuel. Combat is not an aerobic endurance event. It is a series of violent explosive bursts, the same energy system as a sprint, a heavy lift, or a wrestling takedown. That system runs almost entirely on glycogen, the stored form of carbohydrate that muscles draw on for rapid, high-force output. A gladiator whose diet is built around barley porridge arrives at every training session, every sparring drill, every arena appearance with muscle. Glycogen fully loaded. So the fuel matches the demand, every time. Now the beans, Vicia faba, broad beans, are protein-dense and particularly rich in lysine, the amino acid naturally lower in grains like barley. together, the two foods deliver broad amino acid coverage. Modern nutrition science is clear on this. Plant foods contain all essential amino acids, and the body pools them throughout the day. The gladiators eating pulse, barley, and beans in the same bowl at every meal were getting comprehensive amino acid coverage continuously, in volume, without thinking about it. Research confirms that plant protein, consumed in sufficient total quantities, can support comparable muscle adaptation to animal protein in trained individuals. The gladiators ate this diet in large quantities, so their protein intake was not deficient. It was plant-derived. Now here is the part that challenges the image most people carry. Their physiques were not the lean, marble-cut bodies that films portray. Instead, they carried a visible layer of fat over the muscle, not by accident, but by design. Carl Grossschmidt, part of the Ephesus research team, explains the deliberate reason. A fat cushion protects you from cut wounds and shields nerves and blood vessels in a fight. A lean, low-body fat gladiator bled out faster. The carbohydrate-heavy diet produced a protective layer of subcutaneous fat that kept surface wounds dramatic for the crowd while shielding what mattered underneath. Their body was engineered for survival, not aesthetics, and the diet was part of that engineering. But that engineering did not stop at food. If you want a full system built on this kind of evidence, training, diet, recovery, and mindset structured so they work together, the art of living like a man covers exactly that. 5 pillars built on exactly this kind of historical and scientific evidence. Link is in the description. But the diet alone still does not explain what set gladiator bones apart from everyone else in Ephesus. The isotope analysis found a number that separated them from the surrounding population by a factor that stopped the researchers cold. The strontium to calcium ratio in gladiator bones was almost double that of the regular Roman population eating the same city's food. Strontium behaves like calcium in the body. It substitutes for calcium atoms during bone formation and gets locked into the mineral structure. Plants absorb it readily from soil, so the more plant matter you consume, the more strontium your bones carry. But the gladiators' ratio was significantly higher than even the plant-eating civilian population around them, and that meant they were deliberately consuming a strontium-rich source of calcium that nobody else was. Fabian Kanz's team noted that meals of barley, beans, and dried fruit would ordinarily leave gladiators deficient in calcium. Something was compensating for that gap, and the answer was already documented in a 2,000-year-old encyclopedia. Pliny the Elder records it in his Naturalis Historia. Your hearth should be your medicine chest. Drink lye made from its ashes, and you will be cured. One can see how gladiators after a combat are helped by drinking this. So that's exactly what gladiators did. They drank plant ash, mixed with vinegar and water. It was consumed after training and combat as a recovery drink. The team's published conclusion in PLOS 1. Plant ashes were evidently consumed to fortify the body after physical exertion and to promote better bone healing. Fabian Kanz draws the direct modern comparison. Things were similar then to what we do today. We take magnesium and calcium following physical exertion. What gladiators were drinking after every training session was an alkaline mineral solution, high in calcium and strontium, that incorporated directly into their bones during the remodeling process that follows mechanical loading. The result was bones showing significantly higher mineral content than those of the Roman civilians around them. But recovery only completes what training demands. Every session in the ludus created the mechanical stimulus that made bone remodeling necessary in the first place. And the training those men were doing produced a demand that most modern programs never approach. The gladiatorial school, the ludus, was not only a gym. Instead, it included dormitories, training grounds, infirmaries, and armories. Gladiators ate there, slept there, trained there, and were treated there when injured. Their physical preparation was not a schedule they followed. It was the structure of their entire existence. Training followed a staged progression documented by Roman sources and confirmed by archaeological evidence at multiple ludus sites. In the first phase, gladiators drilled exclusively with wooden weapons called udes, deliberately made heavier than the actual metal weapons they would carry in the arena. Ancient sources on Roman military training, including Vegetius in De Re Militari, document practice weapons made to heavier than real specifications specifically to build explosive strength, so that when a gladiator finally lifted an actual blade, it felt lighter and faster in his hands. They attacked the palus, a wooden post driven just under 6 feet into the ground, the way a boxer works a heavy bag, drilling strikes, blocks, and footwork combinations for hours each day from dawn to dusk. The mechanical loading of that drilling, repeated high-force impact through arms, shoulders, spine, and legs, is the same stimulus that drove the bone remodeling that the ash drink was chemically supporting. And here is where every piece of the system connects. The barley loaded muscles with glycogen to fuel explosive training output. The beans provided the amino acids to rebuild the muscle tissue that training broke down. The ash drink provided the calcium and strontium for bones to remodel denser under the loading that training imposed. And the heavier wooden weapons amplified the mechanical demand beyond what a real fight ever produced. So when the real fight arrived, the body was already adapted to something harder. Not one of these elements works without the others. Barley without training is just carbohydrate. Beans without the training demand produce no adaptation. The ash drink without mechanical loading has nothing to repair and strengthen. The system produced the result because all parts ran simultaneously, every day, across an entire professional career. So, how did they get so strong without protein? They did not avoid protein. They just stopped treating it as the answer and started treating it as one part of a system that only works when everything else is in place. The man who walked through that gate in Ephesus was not built by what he ate. He was built by what he ate, what he drank, and what he demanded of his body every single day, running together, without exception, for years. The bones have been in the ground for 1,800 years. The system that built them has not changed. The ancient way exists to recover exactly this. If this changed how you think, you already know what to do. Picture the scene. It is the morning of the third day at Thermopylae. 300 Spartans have held a narrow mountain pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. 2 days of brutal, close-quarters combat. The ground is carpeted with Persian dead. And that morning, before the Spartans take their positions one final time, they don't eat. Not because there is no food, but because this is exactly how they trained for 20 years. And they are, by every account we have, performing at their absolute peak. Now walk into any gym, open any fitness app, scroll through any nutrition channel, and you will hear a version of the same advice. Eat before you train. Fuel your performance. Never go to battle on an empty stomach. Your body needs constant input to function at its best. The Spartans would have found this baffling. And here is why this matters to you directly. Because if you are reading the same advice, following the same programs, eating the same where you have been told to eat, and you are still tired, still not recovering the way you used to, and still feeling like your body is working against you rather than for you, there is a reason for that. The framework you were handed is incomplete. It was built to sell products, not to build performance. And it leaves out something the Spartans understood so clearly, they built their entire civilization around it. They were the most feared warriors in the ancient world. They trained hungry, competed hungry, fought hungry, and they built the most dominant military machine Greece had ever produced. Not despite the empty stomach, but partly because of it. So if everything you have been told about fueling performance is built on assumptions the Spartans systematically dismantled 2,500 years ago, the real question is, what did they know that we don't? The answer starts somewhere nobody would expect. Not on a battlefield, but in a barracks, with a 7-year-old boy being handed deliberately insufficient food and being told to figure out the rest himself. In ancient Sparta, the agoge was the state-run education and training system that every Spartan male entered at the age of 7. Not because their parents chose it, but because the state required it. Boys were taken from their families and would not live at home again for 23 years. The agoge was brutal in ways that make modern military boot camps look comfortable. Boys slept on reeds they cut themselves from the riverbank. They wore a single cloak year-round, in winter, which in the Peloponnese can drop below freezing. They were beaten. They competed constantly. And according to Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD from records and oral traditions dating to the classical period, they were intentionally underfed. This was not neglect, it was policy. The boys were given rations deliberately smaller than they needed. Then they were told they could supplement by stealing. But if caught, and Plutarch is clear about this, they were beaten severely. Not for stealing, for getting caught. The punishment was for the failure of stealth. A Spartan who needed food and couldn't acquire it without detection was a Spartan who would get his entire unit killed. A story told by Plutarch, a Greek philosopher, captures all of this in a single image. A Spartan boy stole a live fox and hid it under his cloak. Rather than reveal the theft and face punishment, he stood perfectly still while the fox gnawed through his stomach. He died before he made a sound. Whether the story is literally true or culturally symbolic, it carries the exact lesson the agoge intended: control, silence, and the mastery of pain over panic. But the deliberate hunger was not only about stealth, it was about building something far more specific. Something the Spartans could not name, but experienced every single day of their training. Something modern science now calls a predatory state. And understanding what that actually means will change how you think about your body entirely. When you eat a full meal, your body shifts into what physiologists call the parasympathetic state. Rest and digest. Blood is routed to your gut. Insulin rises, your heart rate slows, and your brain, in a very real sense, just settles. The body has food, the immediate threat of scarcity is gone. So now, it can afford to relax. This is a deeply comfortable state. It is also, if you are about to fight for your life, the worst possible state to be in. When you have not eaten, the opposite happens. The body activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the system responsible for fight or flight. Here is what that activation actually does. Adrenaline and noradrenaline flood the bloodstream. A study from 2003 published in the journal Physiology and Behavior found that fasted subjects exposed to a stressful environment showed significantly higher noradrenaline responses than fed subjects, making them sharper, faster, and more aggressive. Research from the same period found that urinary noradrenaline and adrenaline levels rose measurably during short-term fasting. And a study from 2007 in healthy humans confirmed that even 72 hours of food restriction reliably increased catecholamine output and heightened sympathetic nervous system activity. What do those hormones actually do? They sharpen sensory perception. They increase pain tolerance. They accelerate reaction time. They pull blood away from digestion and route it directly to muscle and brain. They prime the body for immediate, aggressive output. They create, in plain language, a state of predatory focus that no pre-workout supplement on the market has ever replicated. Because no supplement triggers the sympatho-adrenal cascade that genuine hunger does. The Spartans had no name for catecholamines. They had no concept of the sympathetic nervous system. What they had was 20 years of documented observation. Boys were raised on deliberate hunger, tested constantly, beaten when they failed, and observed to perform better when the pressure was highest. Not in spite of the empty stomach, but with the empty stomach as the mechanism. They built warriors who were, in the most literal biological sense, permanently running on a predatory hormonal profile. The question was, what did they put in the body when they did feed it? Because the answer to that is one of the strangest and most fascinating things in all of ancient history. You see, the Spartans ate once per day, in the evening, together, always together. The syssitia, the communal mess, was not optional. Even Spartan kings ate there. The communal meal was a daily restatement of Spartan values, equality, austerity, brotherhood. And the centerpiece of that meal, documented by Plutarch and mentioned by historians from Pherecrates in the 5th century BC to Cicero writing in Latin, was something called melas zomos, black broth. The recipe, as best historians can reconstruct it, was simple. Pork simmered in its own blood with vinegar and salt until the pot turned almost ink dark. No seasoning for pleasure, no refinement. A visiting aristocrat from Sybaris, a city famous throughout the ancient world for its luxury and its food, tasted the black broth and made a comment that Plutarch recorded, and which has survived 2,500 years. He said that now he understood why Spartan warriors had no fear of death. Death, he concluded, had to be preferable to eating this every night. For some reason, the Spartans took this as a compliment, but what was actually in the black broth nutritionally? The iron content from the blood would have been extraordinary. Hem iron, the most bioavailable form, directly from the source. The vinegar, which prevented the blood from clotting during cooking and preserved the broth without refrigeration, also lowered the overall glycemic response of the meal. The pork provided dense protein and fat. The barley, added to some versions, contributed slow-release carbohydrate with a low insulin response. What the black broth didn't do was spike blood sugar. It didn't trigger a prolonged insulin response. It didn't divert blood to the gut for hours. It fed the body efficiently, allowed rapid recovery from the day's training, and then, as the fast resumed from the evening meal until the following evening, allowed the metabolic and hormonal benefits of the fasted state to accumulate again. There is a word for what their metabolic system had become after 20 years of this training. The word is flexible. A metabolically flexible body can burn fat cleanly when no food is available. It can switch to glucose for explosive effort when required. It doesn't crash when supply drops. It doesn't panic. It simply adapts because adaptation has been trained into it since childhood, through the relentless repetition of going without. This is not starvation. This is conditioning. And the distinction matters enormously, because what the Spartan Agoj was really building, underneath the physical toughness and the military skills and the bronze armor, was a body that had permanently learned to function at its best when the environment was at its worst. And that, it turns out, was only the first half of what the empty stomach was building. The Spartans didn't separate the body from the mind. To them, mastery of one was inseparable from mastery of the other. And the test of that mastery was always, at its foundation, hunger. If you cannot manage appetite, the most fundamental biological drive, the one your body screams about the most urgently, you cannot control anything. That was the Spartan belief. And they built their entire education system around proving it, every single day from the age of 7. Contrast this with the modern reality. We eat while distracted, barely tasting what we are consuming. We silence hunger within minutes of feeling it, before it has any chance to teach us anything. We have engineered a world where almost no one ever sits with physical discomfort, long enough to learn that it passes, that it becomes something manageable, then something useful, then something that sharpens rather than weakens. The Spartan warrior standing at Thermopylae on that final morning was not suppressing fear. He was operating, psychologically and hormonally, in a state that modern neuroscience now confirms was genuinely superior for performance. Sharper perception, higher pain tolerance, tighter focus. The sympathetic nervous system was fully activated, and the hormonal cascade of genuine hunger did exactly what 2,500 years of warfare had shown it would do. This is what modern fitness can never sell you. Not because it does not work, because it does not require purchasing anything. So what does it actually mean for how you live? You don't need to fight at Thermopylae. The biology is identical. Start with this. Train fasted in the morning, at least twice a week, not for hours. 30 to 45 minutes of bodyweight work, a walk, or a moderate session. No food beforehand, just water. What you will notice within 2 weeks of consistency is not weakness. It is exactly what the Spartans noticed across 23 years of the agoge. Sharpness, a quality of attention that simply is not present when the body is busy digesting. The second thing is to extend the time between your last meal and your first. You do not need to eat the black broth. Eating within a 12 to 16 hour window is closer to how the human body evolved to operate than eating from the moment you wake until the moment you sleep. Every serious civilization before the industrial era ate this way, not as philosophy, but as default. It was the body's baseline, though we traded it for convenience. The third is the hardest. Sit with hunger occasionally, without immediately fixing it. Not dangerously, not for days, but when you feel the pull to eat out of boredom or habit rather than genuine need, pause. Observe it. Let it last 30 minutes. Then decide. The Spartans did not need willpower in battle because they had spent 20 years practicing exactly this moment, thousands of times, until the ability to override impulse became automatic. The body is not fragile. The body is adaptable. It becomes what you repeatedly ask it to become. The Spartans did not fight best despite the empty stomach. They fought best because of what the empty stomach had built over a lifetime. A hormonal state of predatory focus. A metabolic flexibility that modern athletes pay coaches thousands to develop. And a psychological relationship with discomfort so deeply conditioned that hunger, cold, pain, and fear simply did not function as obstacles anymore. They had, through 23 years of deliberate practice, made the most fundamental human weakness into a weapon. The modern world will keep telling you to fuel constantly, to never let yourself feel depleted, to treat every biological discomfort as a problem requiring an immediate commercial solution. That approach sells a great many products. It does not produce the body or the mind those 300 men possessed at Thermopylae. The Spartan secret was never about the black broth or the agoge or the cold cloak in winter. It was about understanding that the body follows what the mind demands, and that the mind only learns to demand more when it has been taught, repeatedly and deliberately, that less is survivable, more than survivable, optimal. If this kind of forgotten knowledge is what you are looking for, subscribe. There is far more where this came from, and most of it has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years. A 2022 peer-reviewed study reviewed 8 controlled human trials on intermittent fasting. The researchers were not looking at obese men nor sedentary men. They were studying lean, physically active men, the exact men doing everything right. And what they found should stop every person watching this video cold. Fasting reduced testosterone, not in men who were overweight, not in men who were sick, but in the men fasting and training. The men following the advice. The ones who watched videos like this one and took it seriously. So either everything said about fasting and hormones is wrong, or something else is happening. Something that has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to connect the dots. If you have watched this channel before, you know fasting works. The Greeks proved it. The science confirms it. That has not changed. But here is what nobody is talking about, including most of the fasting content you have ever watched. There is a specific biological trap that modern men fall into every single day. And fasting done the modern way, walks you straight into it. It is also known as the cortisol trap. And once you understand the mechanism, you will never look at your fasting window the same way again. If this is the kind of buried knowledge you come here for, subscribe. There is more where this came from. Now, here is the mechanism. Inside your body right now, two competing systems are fighting for the same resources. The first is the HPA axis, your stress response system. Its terminal output is cortisol. The second is the HPG axis, your reproductive and vitality system. Its terminal output is testosterone. These two systems are not independent. They are directly antagonistic. When one rises, the other is suppressed. When cortisol elevates, it reaches the Leydig cells, the specialized cells in the testes responsible for synthesizing testosterone, and it tells them to stop. Under threat, under scarcity, under stress, the body makes a decision. Reproduction and vitality are luxuries. Survival is not. So resources get redirected. Testosterone drops. Cortisol stays elevated. The seesaw tips, and it stays tipped for as long as the stress signal persists. A 2021 study published in Frontiers in Physiology confirmed this directly. Sustained elevated cortisol in male primates dramatically suppressed HPG axis activity and measurably reduced testosterone levels. Now here's where fasting enters the picture. Fasting is a stressor, a mild one. In a healthy body with intact hormonal rhythms, that mild stress is exactly what you want. It is the mechanism behind growth hormone spikes, fat oxidation, and autophagy. The scientific term for this is hormesis. Small stress applied correctly makes the system stronger. But here's the thing. Hormesis only works when the body is not already under load. Stack a mild stressor on top of a system already carrying chronic cortisol from poor sleep, blue light exposure, deadline pressure, and disrupted rhythms, and the mild stressor is not mild anymore. It becomes cumulative. The cortisol that was already elevated gets pushed further. The HPG axis, already suppressed, receives the shutdown signal. That is the cortisol trap. It is not fasting itself. It is fasting landing on a body whose cortisol baseline is already broken. The study that opened this video did not find that fasting lowers testosterone because fasting is harmful. It found that lean, active, modern men whose daily lives are saturated with chronic cortisol stresses they do not even notice anymore, experience testosterone suppression when they fast. The fast was the final straw on a system already under pressure. The Greeks fasted constantly. Athletes, philosophers, physicians, all of them. And the bodies they built, the ones still carved into marble in museums, were the result. So either Greek men were biologically different from modern men, or they were doing something that protected them from the exact trap modern fasting falls into. The answer is in the structure of a single Greek day. It starts before the fast even begins, in the first 30 minutes after their eyes opened each morning. Picture the morning of the average man watching this video. The alarm goes off. He reaches for his phone before his eyes have adjusted. Notifications, emails, news. Cortisol, which is in the middle of its natural morning rise, receives a stress signal before the body has left the bed. He skips breakfast because he is fasting. He makes coffee immediately, which elevates cortisol further. He sits in traffic, arrives under fluorescent lighting, and spends 4 hours in deadline pressure before his fast even ends. Then he trains at noon, fasted, with cortisol that has been elevated since waking. Then he breaks his fast with something processed and wonders why his results have plateaued. Every element of that morning is working directly against what fasting is supposed to build. Every human body produces a cortisol surge in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking. It is called the cortisol awakening response. Under healthy conditions, it is clean, a sharp peak, then a predictable fall through the morning, reaching its lowest point before sleep. Testosterone follows a parallel pattern. It peaks in the early morning. For it to operate at its ceiling, it needs that window when cortisol rises cleanly and then begins to fall. When the cortisol awakening response is disrupted by screen exposure, chronic stress, or poor sleep, cortisol rises and stays elevated. The testosterone window closes before it opened. Research published by the NIH in 2024 confirmed this directly. Disrupted diurnal cortisol patterns suppress testosterone and worsen insulin sensitivity simultaneously. 2 problems. 1. A broken rhythm. Now add the night before. Artificial light after dark suppresses melatonin, a documented photoreceptor response, not a wellness opinion. Suppressed melatonin means the body does not complete its overnight cortisol clearance. The next morning begins with a cortisol baseline already elevated before the awakening response fires. A 2025 systematic review found that men with chronically disrupted light exposure had measurably lower testosterone compared to men with intact circadian rhythms. The Leydig cells that synthesize testosterone are synchronized to the circadian clock. Cortisol arriving at the wrong phase desynchronizes them. Sleep debt alone reduces testosterone by 10 to 15%. Which researchers confirmed is equivalent to the hormonal decline produced by 10 to 15 years of natural aging, given that testosterone declines at roughly 1 to 2% per year with age. And then there is the refeed. Growth hormone, one of the primary hormones that protect lean mass during a fast, is directly suppressed by elevated insulin. The moment a high glycemic meal lands, the hormonal environment the fast spent 16 hours building collapses. The modern refeed cancels the fast. The man who fasted 16 hours and broke it with processed carbohydrates is hormonally worse off than the man who simply ate a clean meal that morning. The Greeks had none of these problems, not because they were wiser, but because they had no choice. No artificial light, no screens, no processed food. Their constraints built the rhythm modern men have dismantled. And when you look at how a Greek day actually structured light, movement, meals, and rest, it maps almost perfectly onto what modern endocrinology says a testosterone optimal day should look like. It starts at dawn, in a gymnasium, open to the sky. Greek athletes arrived at the gymnasium at dawn, having eaten nothing since the previous evening, completing a natural 12 to 14-hour fast during sleep, without effort and without tracking an app. Their bodies had been in the fasted state for hours before they moved a single muscle. Then they trained. Outdoors, in direct sunlight, the cortisol awakening response fired cleanly. The mild cortisol from the fast metabolized through movement rather than accumulating at a desk. Growth hormone peaked and held. Testosterone, at its natural morning high, operated without interference. Their first meal, the akratisma, came after movement. Barley bread dipped in olive oil, sometimes figs or a small amount of cheese, small and functional. Enough to signal food availability without triggering the insulin spike that would collapse the hormonal environment they had spent the morning building. This is precisely the sequence modern endocrinology identifies as optimal: light exposure at dawn, fasted movement, and a protein and fat dominant meal to break the fast. The most rigorous thinkers of the ancient world examined fasting deliberately, and what they documented maps with striking precision onto modern hormonal science. Pythagoras fasted for 40 days before major intellectual work, and documented sharp increases in mental clarity and physical capability. He refused to teach advanced students until they had fasted themselves, not as a test of willpower, but as preparation. He was right. During fasting, the liver produces ketones that cross the blood-brain barrier and fuel the brain more efficiently than glucose. Research links fasting to increases in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein that strengthens neural connections and accelerates learning. Pythagoras had no word for ketones. He just knew what they felt like. Hippocrates prescribed therapeutic fasting for acute illness, observing that to eat when sick is to feed the illness. He had documented what modern science calls autophagy, the cellular cleanup mechanism that activates during fasting, clears damaged cellular components, reduces chronic inflammation, and earned a Nobel Prize in 2016. Plato divided medicine into two kinds: the kind that gives health, fasting, sunlight, and air, and the kind that gives only the appearance of health. That list is a near-perfect description of what modern hormonal research says men actually need. 3. Men. 3 disciplines, 2,000 years before the science existed. The same conclusion. But the Greek advantage did not end at dawn. It was built just as deliberately at the other end of the day. The deipnon, the primary Greek meal, was eaten at sunset, after cortisol had fallen to its natural low and insulin sensitivity was at its highest. It typically contained fish, meat, legumes, and olive oil, dense protein and dietary fat that provided the cholesterol the body uses as raw material for testosterone synthesis, and slow-digesting carbohydrates that produced a gradual insulin response rather than a spike. Testosterone synthesis occurs primarily overnight during deep sleep, and it requires both cholesterol and the low cortisol environment that the Greek evening naturally provided. Modern men do the opposite. Cortisol is still elevated at dinner. The meal is often high glycemic. Sleep is disrupted by screens. The overnight testosterone synthesis window is shortened at every stage. The Greeks weren't building extraordinary bodies because of better genetics. They were building them because their daily rhythm gave every biological system exactly what it needed. And those principles can be extracted, simplified, and applied in 3 specific changes that don't require rebuilding your life. You don't need to rebuild your life. You need to change the first 30 minutes of it. The 30 minutes before you eat, and what you eat when you do. That's the whole fix. The first principle: protect the morning. For the first 30 minutes after waking, no phone, no notifications. Get outside or stand in front of a window with direct light on your face. Drink water, move your body, even briefly. Let the cortisol awakening response fire and begin its natural descent before any stressor reaches it. This single change resets the cortisol slope for the entire day. Lower baseline cortisol at every subsequent hour. A wider testosterone window. Better sleep that night as the rhythm reconsolidates. One 30-minute decision with compounding effects in every direction. The second principle: move before you eat. Fasted morning movement produces the strongest growth hormone response, keeps insulin low during training, and metabolizes the mild cortisol of the fast through exertion rather than letting it accumulate. The body exits the fast in an anabolic state. Testosterone, at its morning peak, operates in an environment of falling cortisol and rising growth hormone, which is the closest thing to a natural anabolic signal the body produces. 20 to 30 minutes before your first meal is enough. The principle is not intensity, it is order. Movement first, food after. The third principle is to break the fast correctly. Your first meal should be protein and fat dominant. Eggs, meat, olive oil, nuts. Foods that keep insulin low, preserve the growth hormone environment, and provide the amino acids required for repair. The larger carbohydrate-rich meal belongs in the evening when cortisol is at its natural low, insulin sensitivity is at its peak, and the body can actually use what you give it. Light in the morning, substantial in the evening. Let the rhythm dictate the timing. The Greeks were not doing intermittent fasting. They were living inside a biological rhythm so intact that fasting was an automatic consequence of it. They did not track windows. They did not fight hunger. They trained at dawn because the light told them to. They ate in the evening because the day was done. Inside that rhythm, the fast worked. Cortisol stayed where it belonged. The HPG axis ran without interference. The Leydig cells produced testosterone overnight, fueled by the dense evening meal. In the quiet hormonal environment, that followed a day of clean rhythm. Modern men have identical biology, the same axes, the same Leydig cells. What they do not have is the rhythm, systematically stripped away by screens, artificial light, processed food, and schedules that ignore every biological clock the body runs on. The fix is not to stop fasting. The fix is to fast the way the Greeks did. Everything in this video is one piece of a larger system. The complete framework is in the guide linked in the description. It includes fasting structure, light protocol, recovery architecture, and the training method that ties them together. It is built on the same principles. It is grounded in the same history. It is applicable without rebuilding your life from the ground up. The Greeks were not unbreakable because they were exceptional. They were unbreakable because their daily structure gave every biological system exactly what it needed, exactly when it needed it. That structure is available to you. If this is the kind of forgotten knowledge you come here for, the real history, the real science, and what it means for how you actually live, you already know what to do.